Sonwa, who is the Secretary of the Committee for Workers International. The CWI is a socialist world organisation and the Socialist Party is affiliated to it, the England and Wales affiliate. Before I turn to Tony, though, I'm going to ask you to do what we normally have been doing in these broadcasts, which is to help us build the audience. You can do that by sharing the link to this video now on your page or with people that you know or in groups or anywhere that you think you might find people are interested in talking about today's topic, which is the new era of capitalist crisis. You can also start a watch party, or you could just type the names of friends who you think might be interested in the comment box below and alert them. Obviously, during the course of the broadcast, we want to hear from you, your comments, your questions, things you want to discuss further. So do use the comments below, and hopefully there'll be Socialist Party members there to engage and discuss with you as well. But more than that, we don't just want to hear from you in a box on a Facebook page. We want you to come to our Zoom meetings. Every week we're holding 60, 70 Zoom meetings across the country where you can participate, discuss and debate all sorts of issues. And if you're watching this broadcast from outside England and Wales, get in touch with the CWI and they'll put you in touch with socialists and Marxists in your area. Now, as I said, we're going to be discussing with Tony about the factors that have contributed to this new era of capitalist crisis, what are the perspectives for it, and also what are the tasks for the working class. But before that, I just wanted to say something about the burning issue one of the burning issues in Britain today, which is Boris Johnson's reckless return to schools in England. And this is really preparing the way by the Tories for the pushback to work more broadly, to workplaces that are not safe, because the testing, the tracing, the tracking, the infection rates, none of those things mean that it's ready for workers to return to work, and the danger is of opening up a second wave, which could be a more deadly wave of this coronavirus. And obviously we always have to ask, why are they doing this? And one thing that we've been saying in each one of these Facebook Lives and in all our material actually, is that what underlies every decision that the Tories have made in response to the pandemic is that they want to put the interests of big business first. And once you've got that straight, things that otherwise seem mad start to make sense. Why would you send 4-year-olds back to school first? I mean, that just makes the mind boggle, doesn't it? And what impact is trying to enforce social distancing on 4-year-olds going to have on them, let alone why the testing, tracking and tracing is so delayed, why private companies have been invited to run that rather than as public services for profit, obviously. I don't know if people saw it, but the other night the news showed some schools preparing for the return of these little kids, putting away all the soft toys, marking off the books with hazard tape, setting out tiny spaces in which the children can move. A teacher in a Socialist Party Zoom meeting the other night asked the question, what does a teacher do when a little kid like that falls over with social distancing? It does not make sense. So why did they do it? Clearly not for educational needs. And we know that the Tories don't put the needs of children first. Otherwise, why have we seen the welfare cuts, the closure of youth services, the two-child limit on universal credit and so on and so forth, and the millions of children that have been living in poverty before this crisis even struck? It's so parents of young kids can be forced back to work. The Tories have put big business profits before society's needs, before society's health and safety. But this has not been taken passively by education workers. They are flooding into the trade unions. Thousands have joined. Hundreds have signed up as reps, as organisers in the schools. And 20,000 education workers, trade unionists, joined a Zoom meeting last Monday night to discuss this. And the NEU, the main teachers' union, they've produced 5 tests which demand action on a national basis to establish it's safe to further reopen the schools. And they include the things like the testing, the tracking, the tracing, the lower infection rates, the protocols, and the transparency over the science that is being used behind these decisions. So what we're seeing is that once again, it's the working class which shows itself ready to act in the interests of society's safety, to lead on these issues, while the Tories and the boss class that they represent, the capitalist class, prove themselves again incapable of realising the needs of society. And that's why we've got a major feature in this week's Socialist paper on education, staff and parents organising the fight back. It's written by NEU members and parents in the Socialist Party. And as we say in it, it appears that there's hope among some of the union leaderships that they can force the government back by force of argument. But there's obviously no real basis for that kind of an approach, otherwise we wouldn't be in this situation. What's needed is the force of numbers. That's what will prove the strongest argument, and the threat of a mass refusal to cooperate by staff and members and parents. Meetings of hundreds of school workers, of parents are taking place, and if you've not yet been able to participate one or have one organised in your area, get in touch. We've got resources to help with that. We'd also say if you're not yet in a union, definitely join a union. And the simple message coming out of all of that organisation has to be loud and clear. Schools can't possibly be safe to open further as yet, and that school staff right across England should as one refuse to put themselves and their communities in danger. As I said, the Socialist Party has produced material. There's the paper. Last week's Facebook touched on this. The video is available on Facebook and I think on YouTube as well. The podcast, which we produce regularly, also dealt with that issue. There's material on the website, socialistparty.org.uk. We've done a guide for parents, which is an 8-point guide, which we can email you if you get in touch with us. We've produced a poster, which you can send you copies of. And also in some areas, Socialist Party members are taking a lead on organising socially distant, safe protests in support and solidarity with teachers taking this necessary action on the 1st of June and in the run-up to it. So get in touch if you want support or help or any of those resources. So I'm hoping that we're going to be okay. I think we've got the okay now. Thank you from our tech team. Fantastic work that they're doing, getting us going in all of this. So we'll kick off properly now. As I said, I'm Sarah Sachs-Eldridge. I'm the Socialist Party National Organiser. Today I'm going to be putting questions on what we can expect from the next phase of this crisis to Tony Sonwa, who is the Secretary of the Committee for a Workers' International, the CWI, the World Socialist Organisation to which the Socialist Party is affiliated. Hey Tony.
Hi, afternoon.
So I'm going to kick off straight away. I've rambled on a bit in the intro, but I want to kick off straight away because we've got important questions to ask you today. Now, every single day, if you're reading the newspapers, you're going to encounter something about the US attacking China, or government, or vice versa. It's an exchange of insults, which seems to be a daily event, blaming each other for the outbreak of the coronavirus and so on. And before this crisis broke out, we had the tariff war between them as well. The question, therefore, is this a new type of Cold War that we're seeing developing?
Well, I think if we look at the situation, there are some similarities to the old Cold War that did take place in the past, but there's also important differences. So it's not, in that sense, a direct repetition. And the most important difference there is what took place in the former Soviet Union, because the old Cold War, which did exist, was a standoff militarily between two entirely different social systems. Because in the Soviet Union you had the nationalized planned economy, but run by a Stalinist bureaucracy, and it was an entirely different social system to that which existed in the West. Now, this time we've seen the collapse, of course, of the Soviet Union. We've seen a restoration of capitalism taking place in China in a very, very peculiar and in its own distinct way, but nevertheless clearly a capitalist development there with a heavy element of state intervention continuing. And we've seen the outbreak of this conflict now between US imperialism and China itself. Now, what lies behind it? Well, I think from the point of view of the US, there's two issues. One is the economic situation it confronts, as I'll come on to in a moment. The second issue is the subjective desire and obsession of Donald Trump to get re-elected in the presidential elections in November, if indeed they go ahead, as we'll come back to that point maybe a little bit later. But behind all of that is the economic position. And this is a fundamental issue that we're having to confront internationally. Because out of this crisis, the deepest economic crisis since the 1930s, US imperialism is already emerging in a far weakened position. It's still the dominant power, but it's been in a process of decline for a whole period of years. And at the same time, we've seen the strengthening of Chinese capitalism into the global market. And it's staggering the speed with which that has developed. In 2000, the year 2000, China accounted for approximately 3 to 4% of global GDP. By 2019, that had risen to almost 15%. And we've seen a corresponding decline of the position of US imperialism. And in that sense, what we're seeing now is a conflict between these two major powers taking place, which is reflected with the development of the trade wars. It's reflected with the increased military tension which is taking place in the South China Sea. China's coming out of this crisis in a strengthened position globally, and it's using its influence. It's stepping in. If we read the papers today, they're obviously stepping up, used this as an indication of as an excuse, or have used the position to try and strengthen their grip over Hong Kong. They're trying to being very bellicose in their attacks on Taiwan. They've ignored all of the international agreements in relation to the reefs and island that exists in the South China Sea, and you've seen a military build-up, and that's one reflection of it. And of course, we've seen the return to the tariff wars because of this crisis. They've negotiated a standoff in January, and that's now really collapsed fundamentally. We were in the position already before this crisis started that the tariffs imposed by United States against China were the highest they've ever been since 1993. Now, what we've seen is a reimposition of further tariffs in the course of the past period, and they're likely to be stepped up as Trump has used this position to whip up an incredible mood of nationalism, will try to do that, to attack the Chinese, and he's using that for political gains. I mean, it's the usual Trump rhetoric. He's gone on an all-out offensive against Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden's one of the strongest defenders of capitalism you'll find in the United States, but nevertheless, Trump's gone on an all-out campaign against him. In one of his speeches, he just denounced him as Beijing Biden. Is it's an indication of the level of the political argumentation of Donald Trump, but nevertheless, that's what is being dealt with there. And likewise in China, they've whipped up a whole series of nationalist mood as well to try and firm up the position of the Chinese regime. And you've had an incredible outbreaking of Chinese nationalist sentiment, and one of the commentators from China commentated it's probably quite similar to what took place in the infamous Boxer Rebellion in 1900, when there was an explosion of Chinese anti-Western, anti-imperialist feelings then. And all of that's been whipped up, and it's a measure of the accumulating tensions that are developing in this new post-pandemic world that is now beginning to take shape, where we're seeing a complete rearrangement of global international relations, of all the different international powers which exist, and the balance of power which exists between those powers is in the process of changing. The tectonic plates are moving very rapidly. They're not gradually shifting. There is now a very rapid movement taking place, and it's a consequence of the decline of US imperialism. And after the Second World War, of course, America emerged as the number one dominant power. It was the world's policeman, or tried to act as the world's policeman, which was unchallenged, really, on the Western basis. I mean, there were some challenges, but not fundamentally to the point of being able to stand up against it. Didn't mean to say he got his own way. I mean, he did very badly in Vietnam, where they were defeated by the Vietnamese revolution that took place there. But they were the fundamental dominant power. That really died in the killing fields of Iraq. When they went into Iraq, it was a reflection that that era has gone. And now from this crisis, we're going to be in a position of seeing America continuing as the largest economic power, but not unchallenged, and not the sole power that is able to impose its position fully on the new global situation which exists.
Brilliant, thanks Tony, and I'd point people to the CWI website, where you've got a wealth of material going back over some of the issues that Tony's mentioned there: Iraq, Vietnam, the class character of China and so on. But actually, Tony, at the start of that answer, you referred to the US elections and whether the question mark may be hanging over those. I don't know if you want to say anything on that before we move on to the next topic.
We have to be cautious, but there's an unbelievably polarised situation already existing in the United States. It is completely ripped it apart along class lines, and that's going to be reflected in the US presidential elections in November. Now, because of the horrific quantities of deaths which have taken place, and the effect of the economic crisis in the US, there's now over 35 million people unemployed in the United States. It's staggering and the speed with which it has taken place. And in all of the opinion polls, Trump is plunging. Even in Florida, in the opinion polls, he's now behind Biden, and that's despite the fact, I mean, the Democrats with Biden have got the most inept and the weakest representative they can conceivably have. It's why they've invoked Obama, into the fray to try and bolster Biden's support at this stage. And Trump's in a desperate position. Now, it will be extremely difficult and very dangerous territory for them to go in, but it is technically possible, not easy, but technically possible in the Constitution of the US for him to postpone the elections in November. Now, whether he gets away with that, if he tries it, we have to see. But I mean, this is the man who threatened to dissolve and suspend Congress itself if he didn't get his own way. And we are in uncharted territory here. We're now in a situation where what appeared to be implausible yesterday can become very plausible today. And I don't think we could rule out that Trump will take desperate measures and try and do that if it looks like he's going to lose. It's not a certainty, but it's there. It will provoke massive upheavals and battles in the US, but Trump, he doesn't really care about that.
Okay, thank you, Tony. So, next question. The CWI has really over years developed an analysis of the process of globalisation, its implications for capitalism, for class struggle, and also its limits. And without doubt, globalisation and that process is a factor in the creation of this crisis. But now all the economic commentators seem to be looking at the question of deglobalisation, and that's also an issue that the CWI has commented on and analysed. How do you see these processes developing in this crisis situation?
Well, you had in the 1990s in particular, it started before then, but it really accelerated in the 1990s, a phenomenal process of globalization and integration of the world capitalist economy. It was completely locked together, reflecting a period of upswing, reflecting a certain historical conjuncture there. But they never got fully integrated and overcame the barriers of the nation state fully. And now in a period of crisis, we see that process of globalization unraveling as each capitalist class has moved to try and defend its own interests. It's brought itself into contradiction, or to conflict rather, with the with the global position which was existing, or different countries and economic powers. And we've seen that process beginning to unwind. And that was the case even before the onset of this crisis. But like everything else, this crisis has accelerated that process, and now we've seen the reversion back towards national tariffs being established, the development of more nationalism in the policies that have been outlined, the fragmentation of a whole series of international organisations that previously existed, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, what Trump's threatened on that. All of those institutions are largely have been in the process of unravelling to one degree or another. And the national capitalist class in each country has not been able to coordinate its response to this crisis. They've all abandoned generally neoliberal policies for a period, but they've not done it on a coordinated basis. It's all been everybody, take their own actions individually, take a look at their position. And that process is going to continue of deglobalisation. And there's been a tendency now where there was an integration of China into the world market, particularly in relation to the US economy. That process is pulling apart. And all of the capitalist commentators realise that. You only have to look at this week's edition of The Economist magazine. They carried quite an informative article, and the headline spelled it out: "Goodbye globalisation." I mean, it's down the pan as far as they are concerned. Now, it's not going to be easy for China and the US to fully disentangle because of the degree of integration which has taken place, but it is taking place, and they are moving in that particular direction. They have problems with it because of the supply chains that have been established, the different trade routes, etc. But all of that is in the process of being disrupted, and we shouldn't rule out that China will fundamentally disengage from its integrated steps in relation to the US. And the US has been pushed back. We cannot emphasize this enough. I mean, what it happened historically in its backyard, as it was dubbed, in Latin America, the US ruled it. I mean, they used to joke in the Latin American countries that, when you ask where the National Congress in each country was, well, they say go to the American embassy. They just that's where everything was fundamentally decided. And that was intimate. And then we saw, of course, the US intervening, organising and being behind a whole series of coups against different left-wing governments, etc. And that went on for decades, but they've been pushed back fundamentally. China has gone right into their backyard in the course of the past period with its economic investment, which has taken place. It's taken political advantage of this crisis. It's defied the US bans and the US sanctions against Cuba and Venezuela, both of which it's got very good links with. And it's all part of this struggle which is unfolding. And there is now a reassertion of tariffs, of nationalism and national policies, and in that sense, a deglobalisation. Now, how far it goes, we have to see. Coming back here to Europe, this process will be reflected in the EU. It is being reflected inside the EU. You had an incredible integration took place in the European Union, reflecting the process of globalisation at the European level. Some even commentated that the different nationalist castes in Europe would be fundamentally eliminated and we just have one unified European state. Well, that was never a serious possibility in our opinion, but it did go a long way in terms of the integration. Now we go into this crisis. We've had Brexit here in Britain. You've now seen a massive upsurge of anti-EU sentiment in Italy, which has accelerated during the crisis. You see a similar trend developing in France. Even in Germany, there's quite strong question marks and disillusionment with the EU there. And the process of deglobalisation can be reflected in Europe with the possible breakup, or likely breakup at some stage, of the Eurozone, and possibly a disintegration and fragmentation as the European Union as we currently know it.
Brilliant, Tony, and they are some of the factors in this crisis, and I would recommend people go to socialistworld.net and read the latest CWI statement there, which goes into more of the factors that have led to this crisis. But I want to turn now to some of the measures being mooted as ways out of the crisis for capitalism. The main one seems to be the development of green technology. Do you think, Tony, that can offer a way out to growth, a route back to growth for capitalism?
Well, there's no doubt that issue has been put on the agenda, and it's been raised by some on the so-called left as a means of resolving this particular crisis. Now, I think the first thing we have to underline is the depth of the crisis which exists. Here in Britain, I mean, they're talking about the deepest recession for 300 years. I mean, this is not an incidental dip or a blip. This is a fundamental heading towards not only a recession, but a depression and probably a slump, which will last for a period. And that's going to be echoed in a series of other countries. It'll be different in different degrees in different countries, but nevertheless, that will be the clear trend. Now, what they've done is they've junked neoliberalism. They've had these so-called stimulus packages. But what are they amounted to? They've amounted to phenomenal degrees of state intervention and running up of debt over the course of the past few weeks. It's taken global debt to an unprecedented height. The US, to return to that briefly, I mean, they're now speculating if you add together what Trump has done, what the Fed has put into the economy, what all of the different states have also thrown at this crisis, the total amount is between 5 and 6 trillion. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, the amount of alleged resources that have been thrown. Now, the problem they have with this is the ongoing problem that capitalism faces. For capitalism to go into a boom period and to have an upswing, people have to have a disposable income. There have to be the existence of markets. They have to be able to sell their goods. And this is the underlying problem they have, the absence of markets. Now, what is going to be the position at the end of this crisis? More debt has been accumulated. And by the way, what they've done with these stimulus packages is not taken measures to stimulate the economy to open up the market. It's been propping up to avoid companies going to the wall. This money that Trump has put in, just under half of it, it's just been given in grants to the major corporations. I mean, it's not been giving extra funds to people to allow them to have a bigger share of the market, purchase goods, and neither have they used it in a way that, for example, Roosevelt did in the 1930s with the New Deal, where they had a phenomenal stimulus package, but it was used to build railways, it was used to furnish the electricity supply. All of the railways, the electricity supply, the modern waterway system in the US is thanks to what was done under the New Deal. And that was a real development of infrastructure. None of that's happening in the course of this crisis. It's crisis management to prop up what exists. Now, within that context, a switch to the green economy, what will that mean? Well, I think in some countries, they're undoubtedly going to use this to try and step it up. The fossil fuel industry is in a mega crisis globally. We have the horrific situation unfolding with the environment, and some countries will take steps along that line. But the degree of infrastructure needed to completely switch it over to a carbon neutral and an environmentally friendly economy is phenomenal. What's advanced, and capitalism, I don't think is going to have the resources to do that. And the purchasing power, the market is not there. And there's another element that will increasingly come to the fore. All of these issues have been speculated. Some countries may take more measures. Reducing the dependence on the petrol-driven cars, etc., electric cars. Some of that may develop to some degree in the economy, but they don't resolve with that the issue of the market. If people haven't got the money to buy the cars, if people haven't got the money to do all of the other things that are needed with the market as well, is a problem. And there's another issue which I think will, from a global point of view, that will mitigate against it, is the very development of the crisis, as the point we made before, of the nationalism and the race for countries just to get their economies open as quickly as possible, and to take measures rapidly to try and capitalise on the situation in their own particular interests. And that will drive some countries back to using coal, petrol, etc., again, because it's more readily available. And I think all of those factors together will mean that the idea that the green investment is going to offer a path or a roadway to a sustained capitalist upturn is frankly ruled out in terms of what's going to happen. It may have some minor effect in this or that country, but from the point of view of the global economy, it's not going to offer a genuine position. And in many countries, the ruling class are not just going to wear it because they're just after quick short-term profits. And to deal with that, you had to have a struggle against the entire system to go for a viable investment policy of a green character, if you want to put it like that, and the capitalist class are not going to do that in the main.
That has been clear, I think, to growing numbers of people, which is why the environmental issues have been such a mobilising issue for people over the last year, especially the school strikes that we saw. But towards the end of last year, towards the end of 2019, we saw a bit of a change in that, and that there was huge protests, wasn't there? The world was really racked by protests, which for many had the starting point of inequality. And now inequality has been a factor in, is being revealed really by this crisis, isn't it? The coronavirus is an anti-working class disease. We can see that in the cities and so on. But it's also the health and the economic crisis are both affected by the depth of inequality that existed and deepening that inequality. So what effects do you think that's going to have on the situation going forward?
Well, the inequality which was developing, I mean, again, we have to emphasise what existed before. I mean, you had, even prior to this pandemic, the biggest division between, the gap was the greatest between rich and poor that has ever existed in the history of capitalism. You'd have to go back to the Roman Empire, or probably even before that, to see such a division in the gap between rich and poor, which has developed. I mean, it's staggering, the figures which are there. I mean, you have this guy Dyson, you know, what's he? I can't remember his Christian name, but he's a multi-billionaire. He's got personal wealth of about 16 billion pounds or whatever at this particular stage. I mean, it's staggering what has been the concentration of power into the hands of very few numbers. I mean, we talk about the real capitalist class. There has been a bit of a change in the composition of the capitalist class. It's now an oligarchical form of capitalism. It's the oligarchs that, who've looted the planet. Globally, not just Russian oligarchs, we can talk about American oligarchs or British oligarchs as well now. They've accumulated vast amounts of rich wealth in their hands, and before this, in a number of countries, we saw that the consequences of that with a mass demand for change, of social uprisings bordering on revolutions in Chile, in Ecuador, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Iran. It was developing as well. And a major change was in the process of taking place. That was largely cut across in those countries because of the developments of this particular crisis. However, as this crisis has deepened, it has revealed even greater divisions. It's reinforced those divisions that were there before the onset of this crisis. And that's been embedded into people's consciousness and people's understanding. People are aware of the fact of what has gone on, and how the rich have profited, and the measures that have been taken, how they've affected working class people and poorer people to a far greater extent. The onslaught, the tsunami of unemployment, which is in the process of hitting country after country, is a measure of all of these divisions. And it's going to, once again, trigger, at a certain stage, mass social uprisings. We've already seen in Lebanon, the banks being burnt by the protesters. In reality, in Lebanon, the protests never stopped, actually. It more or less continued throughout the existence of this particular crisis. The protests have begun again in Santiago, in Antofagasta, again, against the measures taken by the government. Workers stressing there that they're rioting and taking to the streets because they're hungry. It's not like here where you've had furloughing. You know, they've been laid off, the employment laws have been changed, no compensation for losing your jobs, left at home, allegedly under quarantine with zero money and zero phones. And what are people supposed to do? They've taken to the streets, and the mood is anti-government in all of those countries. And social uprisings are absolutely inevitable as a consequence of this. We have a flurry of strikes taking place in the United States at the present time, as the class divisions have been revealed in an incredible manner in, after all, what is the richest country of the capitalist world at this particular stage. And there's a massive class polarization in the US, as there is here in the UK and elsewhere. In America, it's got elements of civil war are already emerging and present in the situation. You've had some of the right wing intervening and tried to capitalise on that, the problems and the pressures posed by the lockdown, by the organised anti-lockdown protests in Michigan of an armed character, where you've had on the other side Democratic congressmen having to go to the Congress in Michigan with armed guards around them from their local community. You've had the terrible murder of a racist character in Georgia, which provoked local black youth to come onto the streets armed again. And all of this in the run-up to the presidential elections is a measure of what is going to happen as it becomes more intense, as Trump becomes more desperate, and that's going to be reflected in other countries. I mean, the debacle that you have here in the UK with this Johnson debacle, it's the only way you could describe it. I mean, it will be a comedy show if it wasn't so tragic. I mean, if any of the younger viewers would probably not remember it, but the programme of Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, I mean, it was just sheer ineptness and incompetence, driven, as you said, Sarah, in your introduction, by their thirst for profit. But you could not have imagined that the British ruling class would have landed itself with such an inept and incompetent political leadership in the face of the deepest crisis that society has seen probably for over 100 years. I mean, it's staggering, the position here, and that is going to lead to big convulsions here, and we will see it in France as well, where Macron's support is fallen quite dramatically. Protests and strikes are certainly set to develop again there at a certain stage. And that will be, I think, a global phenomenon. But it will not be all one-sided. The right are also trying to step in. We will see the far right try and step in and whip up racism, nationalism. Such is the depth of the crisis. The threat of war between countries in different continents will undoubtedly emerge as a struggle for limited and shorter resources being made available, particularly in Asia and Africa. That will be a threat. We could see the breakup of countries is posed, and even the disintegration of some countries, and a collapse into barbarism, which is partly already present in some of the Latin American and African and Asian countries. It is horrific, the position which is taking place. I mean, and it's so powerless as some of the state machines become. You've seen other forms, because there's not powerful workers' organisations in existence that have stepped in the favelas in Rio, and even in southern Italy. You saw this. The drug gangs have stepped in, trying to get a social base, distributing free food parcels. The mafia has done the same thing in southern Italy as well. So you have all the most rotten elements which exist in the capitalist society have also intervened, and it's going to be a struggle between all of the forces of revolution and counter-revolution, the likes of which we have not seen since the 1930s. Doesn't mean to say we're back for the immediate prospect of fascism as we saw it under Hitler or Mussolini in Italy, but there will be fascistic elements from the far right that will try to step in. We have in India, the Modi government has partly used fascistic methods and some fascist forces in its brutally horrific campaign against the Muslims and against other sections of the Indian population. So we are in for that struggle. It is not going to be a calm sea that will come from this crisis. It is going to be one of an impending storm, the likes of which have not been seen for generations. And that way we have to be prepared with bold, audacious socialist alternatives to build the organisations of working people that are able to face up to dealing with this and end the barbarism which this system has plunged the whole planet into now.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Tony. I think you've really shown us and illuminated a lot for us today on the processes taking place, but particularly on the inability of the capitalist class today to take society forward in any way whatsoever, and the urgent need for workers and young people to organise, a taste of which we're seeing in the unions in Britain today and elsewhere. But what we've got to absolutely raise is the need for a socialist alternative, for a democratic socialist plan for the economy to allow us to meet the needs of all, and not just the profits of the rich, as is the case at the moment. So thanks, Tony, and thanks everyone for watching. Just a reminder, Tony is the Secretary of the CWI, the Committee for Workers International. That's a world socialist organisation to which the Socialist Party is affiliated, and it is definitely, if you haven't done so, worth going to their website and reading the material there. Socialist analysis, workers' reports from around the world from a Marxist and working class point of view, but also to join us for our meetings and discussions where we're taking up all of these issues that Tony's touched on today, here in England and Wales, and also in our sister parties around the world. So you can get all the info on how to contact us via the website socialistworld.net, that's the CWI website, and socialistparty.org.uk, that's the Socialist Party website. Next week we're hoping to do another one of these live broadcasts, and we're planning to make young people the focus of it. We're going to be talking to Theo Sharif. He's the Socialist Party's youth organiser, and he's going to be talking about the situation facing young people at the very sharp end of the economic crisis that is developing rapidly. So put that in your diary now, 1 o'clock, Friday, 29th of May. But I'm going to repeat the appeal to ask you to join again. Across the country, Socialist Party members are playing leading roles in organising the resistance to Johnson's reckless further opening of the schools in England. In this week's paper, as well as the feature on education that I mentioned, there's a centre page article. I've just deftly turned to it, which is written by transport workers, tube workers in London and bus workers across the country. And again, it is workers and trade unions who are the ones pushing for safety. Now, we're not a huge party, but we are effective. Our members are writing those from the positions of leading those struggles in their areas. And we're effective because our members look to the collective strength and potential power of working class people when we're organised. We fight for every improvement for working class people's lives and young people, but we also recognise the need for a socialist transformation of society. And that's how the Socialist Party, our predecessors, were able to lead the successful mass movement against Thatcher's poll tax. 18 million people got organised at local level in anti-poll tax unions, linking up regionally and nationally, and using that to build support and strength to take on the might of what was seen as the Iron Lady and reduce her to iron filings. That's in our history. That's what we're fighting for today. Mass organisation of the working class. That's what we need. So that's why we say join a union, get organised, get active in your union, help build the broad lefts in the unions, but also join the fight for a mass political voice for working class people, and also join the Socialist Party to help us build for all of these things and socialist ideas. And it's because our party takes that working class and socialist approach, and we support each other within the party, learning from each other, and so on, that our members are better prepared to take on the bosses, to take on the Tories, and also to take on the Blairites. So socialistparty.org.uk, that's our website, and if you go there you can click to get in touch about joining the party. You can subscribe to our paper and also to our magazine, Socialism Today. The next issue of Socialism Today is going to be a special issue which is going to be on the lessons from the Corbyn experience 2015 to 2020. You can also donate to our fighting fund, which we always need and always appreciate. And my final ad for this week, before I shut up, is that today we've had Tony speak to us, but next week, or every week, the CWI has its own live broadcasts. They take place on a Tuesday at 3 o'clock British summertime. And over the last weeks, they've been fantastic. They've spoken to socialists and Marxists from India, South Africa, Nigeria, Germany, and so on. Next Tuesday, and sorry, I should say, all of those are available on the socialistworld.net website, and they are definitely worth a look if you've not yet watched them. Next week it's going to be the turn of England and Wales, so tune in to that as well. But I hope to see you back here next Friday, 1 o'clock, to discuss youth fighting back. Don't make this young generation pay the price for the COVID crisis. Thanks very much for watching.